It's Hannibal Lecter stuff, mate. I mean, it's a jail inside a jail. The moment he goes out of that jail anywhere, he's shackled and handcuffed.
It's easy to forget the threats that they faced. It's easy to forget the sort of fear and intimidation and other tactics that were used against them. I didn't doubt our capacity to crack it and get on top of it, but I was worried that we may have run out of time.
You're going to be charged this afternoon with 2 counts of making threats to kill.
I think he might have been using his own product a bit, and people were getting in his ear, and the paranoia was setting in, and people are getting killed for nothing, you know? It's just a waste of life, you know?
I put my hand over my head. I thought this bastard's going to come along and finish me off.
And yeah, answering your question, yeah, I would have been a target. I would have been.
The culture of the underworld has certainly changed over the last 20 years. Once upon a time, it was the hard men who had the respect. Now it's the money men. The big difference is drugs. The people who make the money are those behind the drugs, and with that, they can hire the hitmen to do their dirty work for them. My name's John Sylvester. I've reported on Australian crime for 30 years. When Fairfax Deputy Editor Andrew Rule and I began writing the Underbelly books, we had no idea they would become bestsellers and inspire a television drama. This is the true story behind that gangland war.
Of course, these drug pushers didn't invent gangland violence in Melbourne. There'd always been gangland violence in Melbourne. The painters and dockers knew all about it. In fact, I think the painters and dockers might have buried more people back in the 60s and 70s than we saw killed in this latest gangland war. But the difference was the old-timers did it quietly. They did it secretly. They got rid of the bodies. They buried them deep, or they dropped them out in the bay, wrapped in chains.
The underworld war of those days was about money and about honour.
You had to be able to fight. To get anywhere in the criminal world, you had to be able to fucking fight. And along came drugs. And you didn't have to be able to fight anymore. I mean, the village idiots and town mice were becoming drug lords.
These people got more callous. These people started to behave like the South American gangsters and the Miami gangsters I saw on television. They started to shoot each other in front of families. They started to involve families. And they left the bodies scattered around the streets. And some of them even made the great mistake of seeking publicity.
Obviously, it was about business, some personal animosity, but I guess also we've got some responsibility to a certain extent in that we let them. So, as I say, I'm not sure it was a conscious decision. I think it was just something that evolved over time, and then it just became the way. Payback started to happen. It became a way of doing business.
By the mid-90s, I'd been reporting crime on and off for nearly 20 years. But I have to say I'd never seen anything like the rise of the drug trade at that period, because it split up out of the traditional areas of heroin imported by the Vietnamese and Chinese, the marijuana distributed largely by the Italian gangs out of Griffith and Mildura and Shepparton, and the speed distributed by the bikies. It started to grow in other ways too, because they were getting so-called party drugs. They were getting ecstasy and other designer drugs, which were being produced by a new breed of crook, and it was being sold to a new breed of buyer.
Carl Williams is the perfect example of how drugs made bit players into major players seemingly overnight. Carl was a supermarket shelf stacker, and not a particularly good one. Along the way, he learnt that there was more money in drugs. But the other group heavily involved was what became known as the Carlton Crew. This was a group of, let's call them colourful identities, who were loosely connected. They weren't a gang as such. They worked together, they were friends, but they had their own interests. There was Graham Kinnebra, for example. Graham Kinnebra was a former safebreaker. He was an elder statesman. Mario Condello, a former lawyer who dreamed at one stage of being a crime boss and a High Court judge. A fairly interesting combination. There was Mick Gatto, a colourful identity involved originally in illegal gambling and much later in mediation. And there was Lewis Moran, an old school crook drawn into drugs through his son Jason and stepson Mark. They were the new kids on the block. There was, of course, at one stage, Alphonse Cancatano, who was murdered. He wanted to be a godfather, but he was notorious, he was violent, and he was charismatic.
Oh, he was an egotistical character. He wanted me to team up with him and join up with him, but that would have meant wearing a suit and hanging around Johnny's green room and going, yes, Alphonse, no, Alphonse, 3 bags full, Alphonse, you know. Next thing, the toilet doors come open, Alphonse and his boys are there and they're kicking my heads in. I just remember I wiped my bum and then I got up and I started punching. And I've shut my eyes and I'm punching them back out the door and I've opened my eyes and I'm punching the bouncers. Alphonse has vanished. And I said, fuck Alphonse, you know.
And the police case was quite simple. Jason Moran was driven to Alphonse's house for a discussion. During that discussion, Jason Moran produced a firearm and shot Alphonse dead. Graham Kinnebra was present, and he ran out of the place, unable, of course, to help police with their inquiries. Those close to Jason swear he wasn't involved. The police are adamant. He pulled the trigger. The amount of money that can be made through illegal pills and powders beggars belief. With a bit of help and a bit of knowledge, they started to realise that they could produce ecstasy and pseudo-ecstasy in pill form. Melbourne had always had a strong market for amphetamines, but this was a new market. Young people who would gobble these things up at the weekend. So it was endless. But at the same time, the Victoria Police made a huge mistake with its drug squad. The drug squad was planned to be a super squad of up to 200 people. Usually you would move on out of a corruption-prone area like that after 2 or 3 years. But it started to let people stay for many, many years, which increased the risk of corruption.
It was, by the late 90s, a very messy setup with a lot of people making a lot of money, and some of those people making money happen to be police.
One of the methods that the police were using was called controlled deliveries. And what they were doing was that they were buying chemicals at a wholesale rate and then by using informers, selling them at the black market rate, and were following them in the bid to get to the Mr. Biggs.
Using them as bait to catch crooks, allegedly.
Do you know that they were actually the biggest customer for Sigma, the wholesale drug manufacturers? They were the biggest customer in Australia.
The drug squad.
The drug squad.
Magnus.
It was inevitable that it would come to a bad end because that drug squad wasn't up to handling the pressure put on it. And in the end, it collapsed under that pressure.
There is no such thing as a war on drug trafficking. It was lost, if there ever was one, a long, long time ago. And whilst people in the drug field have such vast sums of money at their disposal, then I'm afraid corruption will continue.
When you talk about corruption, police have many, many defensive methods, and they just avoid ever dealing and never confronting it. Because when you're chasing a crook, it's not personal. He's a two-dimensional object. when you're chasing a policeman who's a crook, he's one of you. Even if he's bad, he's like the bad relative. Very, very uncomfortable.
The sense of betrayal that's felt in an office when that happens, and I've been in that circumstance, is unbelievable. You just have people walking around in the days, you have people in tears, and quite frankly, some of them never ever recover from it, and they never go back to work in those areas again.
Now, these people tend to live their life like they're out of a Hollywood movie, but they didn't actually have the brains or the decency to actually start the war in that style. And they behaved in the way that they'd watched on television. I had a meeting with somebody connected with the Carlton crew, and during it, I realised he was doing Marlon Brando out of The Godfather. And that's the trouble with many of the gangsters, is they learnt it all. They thought The Sopranos was a documentary.
Most the funny thing is, they don't realise it's called the underworld for a reason, because you're supposed to be under.
Yes, out of sight.
There's not a lot that's nice, glamorous, exciting about the way they lead their lives, and I think it's unfortunate that some of them have almost taken on celebrity status.
Some people think because you're looking after crooks, you're a crook yourself. I mean, you got to deal with all these things. The culture now, it's more difficult to speak with younger members of the police force because of perhaps a distrust. You're going to have a feel for this to work in the dustbin of life.
Carl Williams, he really looked like the kid next door. If the kid next door had a baby face and weighed about 17 stone and lived on nothing but fast food and soft drink, Carl loved fast money. He loved fast women. And where he came from, there's only one way to pay for it, and that was with selling drugs. And it wasn't long before Carl, with a bit of help from his father George, who was really just a petty crook, got hold of a pill press and started to make a lot of pills and selling them in the nightclubs. And of course they made the big mistake of undercutting some very dangerous people who were in that line of trade, the Moran brothers.
Now, these three men knew each other, but they weren't friends. They had worked together, but they still didn't like each other. Carl Williams had married Roberta, and Roberta was the former wife of a good friend of the Morans, so they weren't happy with him over that. Secondly, Carl was selling his drugs much cheaper than the Morans. They didn't like that. There was also a dispute over the ownership of a pill press. The Morans believed it should be theirs. Carl Williams had possession of it, said it was his. And lastly, Carl Williams had actually done a pill press job for the Morans, but he hadn't used enough binding material, so the pills were falling apart and the Morans couldn't sell it. And the date was October 13, 1999. It was a tiny little park in Gladstone Park, no bigger than 2 suburban blocks. Totally open, houses on 3 sides, nothing else. And that was where there was going to be a meeting between Carl Williams and Jason Moran and Mark Moran.
So there's an argument over pills and over money. If Carl thought he'd be safe, he was wrong, because Jason Moran pulled out a small pistol, a 22 Derringer is how it's been described, but certainly a small pistol, and he threatened Carl Williams with it. And his brother Mark said, shoot him in the head, shoot him in the head. Or words to that effect. Jason said something like, well, if I shoot him dead, how are we ever going to get our money back? And he shot him in the belly instead. And that is actually how the Underworld War proper, the hot end of the Underworld War, began. Because had they killed Carl Williams that day, none of this would have happened. There would have been no Underworld War.
Jason shot bloody Carl in the guts. Mark was right, he should have killed him. He should have bloody killed him.
That was his great mistake. If he'd killed Carl Williams then, he'd just be another dead gangster. People would have thought it was the Morans, but it wouldn't have gone anywhere. But they let him get up. He went home. His mum had baked him a cake because it was his birthday. It was his 29th birthday on that very day. but a shot in the stomach tends to dull the appetite.
They were the architects of their own demise. This was never ever going to end until Carl Williams was either dead or in jail.
He was motivated for revenge. He went off and made a lot of money, and he spent a lot of that money making sure he got his revenge on the Moran brothers.
But what happened, and consistently happened over the next few years, was a bizarre set of circumstances which made all the planets line up so that we had this unprecedented war. Carl got out of hospital, and he must have been a workaholic because he was straight back into making drugs. The local police at Broadmeadows were doing a very minor fraud case involving credit cards. They went out to a housing commission property and they heard this crunching of a machine. It sounded like the Ford factory, really. They realised exactly what was going on. Kicked the door in, and there was the pill press, going a million miles an hour. They slip upstairs, and there's Carl Williams lying in bed with the sheets over him. They pull it back, he's wearing a red Mambo shirt, he's fully dressed.
Split infinity. Yeah, oh, thanks.
He's charged. And that job was worth $20 million. So he goes into jail, but while in jail, he meets a crook that we can only refer to as the runner. And he offers that crook $100,000 to kill Jason Moran. The runner was a man who did armed robberies, a career criminal, and been a gunman for 2 decades. His trick was to park his car, his getaway car, a long way from the bank or whatever his target was. He'd do the job and then he'd run, hence the nickname. Anyway, he doesn't blink an eye. He just goes, yep, no worries, I'll do that when I get out. So he's got his hitman. So what we had Carl Williams and we had the Morans all facing different drug charges. But remember, you've got corruption charges against the drug squad as well. And quite rightly, it was decided that the corruption charges against the police had to be dealt with first, because these detectives were the star witnesses in the drug cases.
What will, in fact, emerge is that there was a fairly high level of corruption, that particular individuals, some of whom are still waiting trial, I shouldn't mention their names, but who were undoubtedly paying off police for protection and information.
There's a need to be a little bit cautious here because there are some current matters before the court where this whole issue may well be central to those matters. But I think it's now a matter of record that corruption, police corruption, was definitely a factor in allowing some of these people to get to the position they got to and then assisting them to remain there.
What happens then is that Carl's bailed, and around that time, in that very same week, Jason is jailed for a series of assaults in a King Street nightclub, which left several people, including one woman, badly injured. So, like ships in the night, they pass. Carl's out, but Jason's in. Carl decides at this time that it's probably best if he goes after Mark Moran, who's isolated without Jason there. First off, Mad Richard Mladenovich is shot dead. It's believed that he was probably Mark Moran's minder. So Moran's exposed. Now, these crooks are often considered to be cool and calm and calculating. Well, they're not. They're idiots. Mark Moran has good security on his house, and in his business you'd want it. But he parks his car outside in the street. Perfect spot for Carl Williams. In the dark, he ambushes Mark Moran and shoots him. Mark Moran is shot dead outside his luxury $1.3 million home in Aberfeldy. Carl Williams is probably involved in up to 10 murders, but this is the only one where he pulls the trigger.
Mark was the best of the lot. I love Mark. Entirely different to Jason. Mark was a lot harder than Jason. A lot harder. Jason was a pussy compared to Mark. Jason, I can remember him crying on my shoulder at least 4 or 5 times. Bertie, I've killed Mark.
Mark Moran, he's an unemployed pastry chef. Where does he get the money? That's the clear message, having covered this for so long, is that people want to know how come these people had so much money and no one was locking them up. Why wasn't the tax department going through them? Good point. The Morans have a council of war. They look at the potential list of enemies, which is not short. Carl Williams' name is on it, but he's not by any means the first name on the list. They still think of him as like their puppy dog that they've hit with a rolled up newspaper and that he'd cower away. So they didn't think he'd have the dash to do what he did. Jason Moran gets out. The parole board, aware of the risks to him, actually let him go overseas, which is highly unusual. Jason Moran is given a second chance. He can take his family, he can live overseas, he can live a relatively normal life. But, like many of them, he was in love with being a gangster, a mob star. As long as the word star was there, they were happy. So he came back, even though he had to know that there was a great risk to his life. The runner, by this stage, is out. He's teamed up with Carl Williams. He's prepared to do the job. Again, we refer to these hitmen as cool and calm. Most of them are totally stupid.
Jason was well aware that he was in the firing line, so he kept moving and changing address. He was pretty good at it, as most crooks are.
I always said, listen, I'll live longer than you, Jason. I said it to him 2 weeks before he died. Met him up here in Smith Street, Collingwood. And I was wearing a coat like this, and I walked up and shook his hand. He backed off. I knew he was carrying a gun. Well, I wasn't carrying a gun, but he thought I was carrying a gun. And he gave me a shaky handshake. And I said, you want to pull up, Jason? I said, look, I'm going to live longer than you. He said, we'll see about that.
I think we all realised how low the crooks would go when they shot Jason Moran and Paddy Barbaro in a van at a little kids footy match out at Essendon. A gunman ran up and he shot the 2 men in the front seat of the van while the little kids were in the back, so close that they were actually spattered with blood. It was a terrible crime. Killed Jason and his mate like that in front of the kids, I think everybody, all Australians, realised just how evil they were.
Think of Mark Moran's kids who were in the house when their dad was killed and then are in that van when their uncle's killed.
Yeah, right in front of them.
And Pasquale Barbaro was just sitting there. I mean, the bloke who killed him didn't even know he was in the car. You can never deal with this as to think some sort of romantic battle between two sides. It's not. It's about killing people. It's about ambushing people. It's the most awful, hideous, traumatising scene for strangers to see a body that's been mutilated by a gunshot. What it would be like for kids just beggars belief. There was blood everywhere. Take the bigger picture. You've got a lot of kids there and parents. And what would have happened when the runner ran if a parent had tried to grab him? Well, we know what the runner would have done. And yet everyone sort of says there were no innocent victims. Well,
collateral damage everywhere. Did he throw the guns down, or one of them did? F1 there, yeah.
The runner gets away, goes down to St Kilda, where he meets Carl Williams and tells him I've done the job. Carl Williams, full of gratitude, opens his pocket and produces an envelope with $2,500. And that's all he got. He was promised $100,000 and he got $2,500. Didn't stop him going out that night and having a lovely meal with his family. Didn't seem to worry him about the fact that he'd killed 2 people earlier in the day.
I don't think any of us expected it of Carl, because he was just, as he's been portrayed, the fat boy that was a hanger-oner, was doing his best to learn the trade that he eventually majored in. But as to initial suspect, no.
I think he pushed it a bit too far, and I think he might have been using his own product a bit, and people were getting in his ear, and the paranoia was setting in, and people looking for business, you know, saying kill this one, kill that one, and of course there's all sorts of money being thrown up. There was no Carlton crew. That's just all been a myth. It's it's not true, and it's just been invented just to sort of sell papers and make good television, I guess. People tie you together. Unfortunately, the media do that. They tie you together, you know, with, I think there was a death notice in from Iran that sort of put me with the rest of them there, and they tie you into it all. And yeah, answering your question, yeah, it would have been a target. It would have been.
The runner came from a life of crime. His father, I think, was basically insane. This is a primary school kid who came home one day to find Dad was actually stabbing Mum. So that wouldn't help him. He spent much more of his life in prison than out.
Well, I always say if you do more than 5 years, you lose your life. I mean, I don't think you can mentally recover from more than 5 years in prison.
The changes in the drug world meant that some crooks just came from nowhere and became big players seemingly overnight. Andrew Veneman was one of them. He was just known out in his suburb as a bit of a hothead. But within, it seemed, months, he became a major player.
And within a blink of the eye, he's seemed to be responsible for several murders.
Yeah. Looking back on it, it seemed that the police didn't really take a lot of notice of what was going on until the bodies started to hit the pavement. The public became concerned, the media made a splash of it, and suddenly the police command realised that they had a problem, and that problem had got away from them. It was then they realised that they had to make up for lost time, that they didn't have the criminal intelligence stored up about these people.
And one senior policeman did say that he feared that all the answers to the Underworld War were out there with his own members.
What I'm about to say in no way reflects on the troops, because I think they were working hard and doing their best in a pretty difficult situation. But I think at a higher level, we dropped the ball in a couple of ways. One is we didn't actually recognise what we were dealing with and deal with it in a joined up way, which is what we subsequently did. And clearly our intelligence wasn't up to speed.
Up until this point, they'd been chasing after the event, after a crime. They had refused point blank to accept that there was an underworld war. They had individual homicide crews looking at individual murders and not connecting them up. Everyone had a piece of the jigsaw, but no one would actually put it on the table. That's where Piranha came in, by gathering it.
So what they did, they actually, for once, they allocated the manpower and the money and the time and the resources. And by resources, I mean things like wiretaps, phone taps, and listening devices, just to nail down the prime movers.
And they started to make inroads. They were able to track some calls, and through that they started to link in to associates of Carl Williams and of the runner. Now what the police did and how they did it, I don't know. but they bolted in front of the crooks for the first time.
Putting them into a position where, quite legitimately, we could put a lot of pressure on them to think about what they wanted to do, and get them into a position ultimately where they rolled and would agree to cooperate, give us the information that then allowed us to further develop the picture, fill in some of the missing pieces, and then go again.
Of course, the police have a good psychological advantage in this way, don't they? You know, it's the one thing they can offer somebody who's doing life is you're never going to get outside that cell again unless you come out for a week with us and talk to us. It's a great incentive.
The one thing that they can do is break the boredom.
Ever lost a client who's rolled over?
Sure.
As in being shot?
Or their demise in another way, yeah. Yeah.
Anyone in particular?
No one that I want to name at the moment.
Fair enough. So while the shootings continued, they started to profile the crooks. Who was Andrew Veneman? Who was Carl Williams? How were they connected?
I'm at a loss to understand why it went on for as long as it did without somebody, without the police being able to find out from an informant or whoever else it was that, for example, Andrew Veneman had killed 6, 7 or 8 people, whatever it was.
Somehow, police found the clean car that the runner would use in another job. And they put a tracking device and a listening device in it. So they were in front. The crooks come and get it, hop in it, drive away, and the brake light starts flickering. The crooks stop and they find the tracking device in the car. The job's blown. Well, so you would think. But what happens is they drive to Carl Williams, who by this stage is so full of himself he refers to himself as the Premier, because I run this state. So at this point they show the listening device to Carl, and Carl goes, I don't care, we're doing the job. What police don't know is what is the job. The job is to kill a fellow by the name of Michael Marshall. Michael Marshall lives in a double-storey house in South Yarra. Michael Marshall is a hot dog seller, so it doesn't take too much to work out what else he was selling. On the day, which was a Saturday, the tracking device or the electronics drop out right at the wrong moment, and they're a bit like a mobile phone, so they don't know what's going on. By the time it's back on, the runner's out of the car, going, and the next thing they start getting calls from 000. Michael Marshall has been shot dead next to his young son. The runner has run up, it was raining, he fires one shot, slips on his backside when he does it, gets up and keeps shooting until he kills him. The runner heads home, gets home. He's got to know he's hot, and what does he do? He picks up the phone and he rings Carl and he says, you know that horse you liked? It was scratched. Well, it's got to be the worst coat in the world, and it's picked up on a listening device. He's arrested, as is Carl Williams.
They provided you with advice in respect to the manner in which you should conduct yourself in the interview today?
Yeah, just advice, yes.
And what advice have they provided with you?
Just not to make no commentary for the interview or remain mute.
But Williams starts to realise they've got the runner cold, so he tries to distance himself. All of a sudden, Carl's being looked after by a QC. The runner's on legal aid. Carl wants a separate trial. The runner says to him, well, look, at least be decent and look after my old mum. Can you give us some money? He sends her 10 grand. Carl Williams was making $100,000 a month in his prime. Carl Williams' big mistake was shortchanging the runner. He had promised him $100,000 for killing Jason Moran. He paid him $2,500. On several occasions he was dudded and he resented it, and we'll never know. But the likelihood is that if Carl Williams had kept his promise, so would have the runner. Very, very stupid move to shortchange a hitman.
These people have been allowed to just continue on with their trade and get bail. continually get bail, continually offend, continually drive their organisations and influence their organisations while they're out on bail. I mean, how can you police something where you're locking people up and they're going through the revolving door and thumbing their nose at you?
Slowly, many of those connected with the Morans were hunted down and shot dead. Graham Kinnebra, old school, killed outside his house in Kew. He turned up at home and the hit team was waiting. Graham got one shot off, but it wasn't enough. That was the murder that really, really affected Mick Gatter. That wasn't business. It was personal. Carl Williams was an unlikely looking gangster. He is a bloke with a ready smile. It was difficult to sit and talk to him, knowing what he'd done. After Graham Kinnebra was murdered, I sat with him in the world's worst coffee shop, and he was wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and he sat with his back to the road. And I wanted to actually say to him, look, you know, in Gangster 101 you don't do that. You got to wear a designer suit and sit and scowl a bit. But that was part of his, not his disguise, but probably put a lot of people off, in that you looked at him and you thought, I don't see him as the sort who can organise all these hits. Carl Williams?
What about him?
You had a meeting with Carl Williams trying to sort it out at one stage at the casino?
Well, I wasn't trying to sort it out. I was trying to find out who killed Graham. And until that point, you know, it had nothing to do with me. You know, it was a war over him getting shot by Jason, and whatever happened there was their business. Nothing to do with me. But once they killed Graham, yeah, you know, it involved me then. And yeah, I was making active moves to find out who was behind it. And that was the reason for the meeting with Carl. And he, you know, denied it strenuously. He said he respected Graham, he never knew him, he had nothing to do with it. I don't know about that. I think he did.
Police warned Lewis Moran that he was likely to be on the hit list, and they urged him to be less predictable in his movements. But Lewis didn't listen.
We didn't really care. We thought we were old-time gangsters and took no notice of the up-and-comers, so to speak, whereas we should have learnt. We got death threats every week wherever we were drinking, and it was usually Carl on the phone screaming and shouting. Both the drug squad and Piranha were both fairly down on us, more so the drug squad, because if we were pinched with a gun being on bail, we would have gone straight back on remand.
It was a game of deadly musical chairs, and every time the music stopped, one of them got shot. Certainly Andrew Veneman idolised Mick Gatter at one point. Conventional wisdom is that he started to work for the Carlton crew, doing jobs for them. Then there was a bashing in Logan Street, which left a man in hospital. And around that time, Veneman appeared to change sides and became close and personal with Carl Williams. Carl Williams wanted him to deliver Jason Moran to be killed, and Veneman never did. So even though Williams always said Veneman was his closest friend, in reality, he didn't trust him. He wasn't actually sure that if he changed sides once, he wouldn't change again. Towards the end, Williams would never meet Veneman on his own, frightened of an ambush. Veneman was becoming increasingly isolated, and in that world, you need all the friends you can get.
I've been meaning to drop in at that joint where you're there. Mate, I'm there every day, buddy. Every day, buddy. I promise you, mate. I swear to you, I'm going to come. I want to come. Mate, anytime you want it, buddy. Yeah, I know that. All right. You take care of yourself, all right? Keep in touch. Thanks very much, buddy. Take care, Andrew. Yeah, buddy.
He spoke to me and he said, I've got to come and see you. I hadn't seen him for a couple of months. He was running with the other side there, and I was just curious what he wanted. So I rang him on this day, and he rocked up there. And he was the one that actually suggested we go out the back and have a quiet chat. And that's when it all took place, you know. I was telling him that the rumours were still right, that he had something to do with Graham, and he said, mate, I wouldn't do that to you, you're a friend of mine. And I said, well, it's funny you say that, PK and Dibra were your friends too, and you killed them. And anyway, we got in a little bit of a heated argument, and I just said to him, look, you can't be trusted, and I don't want you in my company, in our company, simple as that. And the next minute he just stepped back and produced the gun. And then we had a struggle, and one nearly hit me in the head. And fortunately, he got shot, I never. He died, and that was the end of it. I spent in like Hannibal Lecter, locked up and shackled like a dog. But anyway.
When the jury came back, he sat there and he addressed his family, and he said, we're going to hear the most important words of our life. They'll either be one word or two, guilty or not guilty. The jury returned, they looked at Gatto, which is always a good sign, and they announced not guilty. Gatto told the jury that he was glad he'd shot Benji, because he said if I didn't do it, he was going to kill me. And he said, and if it wasn't me, I would have been given the keys to the city for doing it. Andrew Veneman at the time was under constant police exposure, and it was said that he'd stopped routinely carrying a firearm. Gatto's version of events was that he had a gun on this occasion. We'll never know what Veneman had to say about it. Police suspect that Andrew Veneman was present during at least 7 murders, and probably the trigger man in nearly all of them. For Lewis Moran, it was always going to be a case of when and where. It was March 31, 2004, and it was the Brunswick Club over a cool beer.
I turned around to pick up the change off the bar we were going, and I said, let's get out of here, Lewis. I had a bad feeling that night. This bloke burst through, elbowed me aside, put a shot into Lewis's groin, and pushed him towards the passageway. And whilst he did that, while he had the shot in him, he turned around and smiled at me. And you could see underneath his balaclava, gave me a good look. Then I ran towards the front door. As I'm going towards the front door, I see this other bloke pointing the shooter at me. He was going to hit me right in the head, and span around, tried to kick him. He shot me with a 9mm Hydra shot, and I put my hand over my head. I thought, this bastard's going to come along and finish me off, which is what you normally expect anyway. They must have had me on the stretcher by then, and I said to them, mate, is he off? And they said, yeah, he's dead. He's dead before he hit the ground.
And then finally, Mario Condello, killed when he returned home to make sure he made his curfew. For bail, but there is at least one hitman waiting for him. Piranha are desperately trying to roll over key players connected with Carl Williams to give evidence against him. They're having some success, but they don't even bother going near the runner because he's so old school. He's never spoken to police, ever. But all of a sudden, there's a letter that arrives at the Director of Public Prosecution's office. It's a letter from the runner saying, you better come and see me. Members of Piranha go out, grab him, take him out to a secret location, keep him for 3 weeks, where he makes statement after statement after statement. At the end of it, they say, what do you want? He says, I'd kill for a vanilla slice.
The code of silence is a load of rubbish as far as I'm concerned. Every one of them, 90% of the people will cut a deal when it's their neck that's in the noose.
We were doing deals with shooters, but quite rightly, the police and the Director of Public Prosecution said there is a higher group that we want to get. They're the ones who gave the instructions, who paid to have these jobs done. So a deal was done for the runner. If he is lucky, he won't die in jail. He'll leave jail as an old man, but there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Is it your intention to remain mute for the remainder of the interview in relation to any questions asked about this offence?
The murders of Terry and Christine Hodson was the low point of this whole gangland war. Previously, people thought it was crooks killing crooks. Terry Hodson was a police informer. He's killed before he can give evidence in a police corruption case. The case collapses. If it is true what Petra say, that these events are linked, well, you're killing a friggin' star witness. You might as well go and kill a judge.
They were already frightened. They had guard dogs, but they let someone they knew into their house, and their reward for that was to be made to kneel down on their own kitchen floor, and both of them were shot dead. Christine was shot dead merely for the fact that she was there and she would have known the shooter's face.
To kill Terry Hodson was really an attack on the whole criminal justice system. To kill a witness is to attack the system itself. It was no longer crooks just killing crooks. It was an attack on all of us.
When I did the planning for the phase of Piranha that I ran, part of that planning was corruption. I told my people, you will encounter serious corruption during the course of this investigation. I didn't know what it was going to be, but I knew we would uncover it because it's endemic to organised crime. Organised crime does not exist without some form of corruption.
Time was running out for Carl. If all the trials went ahead and he was found guilty, he was certainly going to be sentenced to life with no minimum. His lawyers wanted him to do a deal so he could get a minimum sentence, but he kept playing games until February of 2007. Virtually just before a jury was impanelled, he made noises finally that he would do a deal. Carl Williams was escorted into the court. He needed to formally plead guilty to 3 murders if a deal was to be done. During the delay, Carl's parents, George and Barbara, were allowed into the court proper. And while George remained silent, Barbara begged her son not to plead guilty. And then the court was convened. Everyone held their breath, and then Carl Williams pleaded guilty to 3 murders. Jason Moran, Lewis Moran, and small-time drug dealer Mark Marlier. The deal Williams wanted was 33 years as a minimum. That would mean he could get out when he was 69. To do that, he needed to cooperate with the authorities. So Carl got up and he made a self-serving and clearly bogus statement. It was designed to show his colleagues that he hadn't rolled over on them, and it was designed to actually damage prosecution witnesses in upcoming cases. He sat down with a smile, but the judge, she wasn't smiling at all, and Justice King made comments about the clearly disingenuous nature of the statement. It showed that he hadn't reformed at all. So instead of getting 33 years as a minimum, he got 35. Williams was filthy and tried to make a statement from the court. But Justice King simply looked and said, "Take the prisoner away." And that was the last moment that Williams was seen as almost a free man. Now, police would like to say we've learnt from our mistakes. Well, let's wait. Let's wait and see in 5 or 10 years whether that will still exists.
The challenge for us is to manage organised crime and to keep it at a level that's acceptable to the community. That's what we've got to do, but to pretend that somehow we're going to make it go away or disappear, I think we're just kidding ourselves.
Over that era, there were 33 underworld deaths, and 17 of those were loosely connected. But in some of the cases, they were innocent victims, people not connected, not gangsters, but witnesses or people who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Carl Williams says he can look in the mirror, and what he sees looking back as a soldier, he's just got it so wrong. He said he never shot any innocent people or had them shot. Carl Williams, in one regard, became a serial killer, in that he wouldn't stop until he was caught.
You begin to believe your own bullshit, I suppose.
Some of them did, that's for sure. I mean, Carl Williams referred to himself as the Premier because he said, "I run this state." Correct. He lost the election and got 35 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long time in office.
So this is not a war. It's based on greed. It's based on the drug market. There's no honour in what went on. And even now, if Carl wants to glorify what he did, well, if that gets him through the night in maximum security, good luck to him. Because he won't see his daughter's 16th birthday, her 18th birthday, her 21st. If he's lucky, he'll leave jail an old, hunched over, desperately sad man. If he's lucky.
Join us tomorrow as time is running out in the intriguing case that has everyone guessing. Will new evidence be uncovered to point to the prime suspect? Don't miss the gripping new series, Hunter, 8:30 tomorrow night on ABC One.